The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical drone as Ashley Cooper pushed through the emergency entrance of Oak Creek Memorial Hospital at 5:19 a.m., 13 minutes before her shift officially began. The antiseptic smell hit first, that sharp chemical bite that never faded no matter how many times you walked through those doors, the same smell that lived in her nightmares 6 years after leaving Tikrit. She kept her eyes down, the way she'd learned to keep her eyes down, moving through the corridors like a woman trying not to take up space in the world. Her scrubs were navy blue, faded from 100 washings, and her badge hung from a fraying lanyard that had seen better days. Nobody looked at her. Nobody ever looked at her, which was exactly how she wanted it. The ICU ward at 5:52 a.m. was a symphony of machines. Ventilators whooshed their rhythmic breathing. Heart monitors beeped their steady counts. For pumps chimed softly when bags ran low. Ashley moved through it all like a ghost, checking her assignment board with hands that were steady now, after the coffee in the break room had cooled enough to drink. Room 347. Post-operative cardiac patient. General rank. Navy SEAL. The words registered without emotion, the way she'd trained herself to process information, clinical, distant, professional. She'd been a nurse at Oak Creek Memorial for exactly 9 months and 2 weeks. Long enough to blend in. Long enough that nobody asked questions about the woman who showed up, did her work, and disappeared into her efficiency like a stone sinking through water. Room 347 was at the end of the east corridor, past the supply closet where the good syringes were kept, past the medication lock that required your badge and your PIN. The door was half closed when she approached, and she could see him in the hospital bed, the general, they called him, though she knew his real name from the chart. 71 years old. Routine cardiac surgery completed at 11:44 p.m. the previous evening. Stable vitals. No complications. Heavily medicated on morphine and the kind of anesthesia that made time collapse into something meaningless. His left arm lay outside the blankets, and there it was, the tattoo. The one that had been inked onto his skin 6 years ago after the bridge at Tikrit held and the smoke cleared and he'd told her that her name would be the last thing he remembered before he died. Ashley Cooper. Careful block letters on his left bicep, dark blue ink that had faded slightly over the years. She could read it from across the room. He couldn't even see her. She knocked softly on the door frame, 2 quiet taps that wouldn't startle him but would announce her presence before she entered his space. The general's eyes moved slowly, syrup-thick, finding her face without focusing on it. The recognition she half expected, half dreaded, never came. There was no flicker of memory. No sudden tightness in his expression. He was a medicated man looking at a nurse, and that was all. Ashley stepped into the room and closed the door with a soft click, the sound like a prayer she'd forgotten how to say. "Good morning, sir," she said, her voice pitched low and even, the voice she'd cultivated over 9 months, deferential without being obsequious, professional without being cold. "I'm Ashley. I'll be checking your vitals this morning." He nodded slightly, his eyes already drifting back toward the ceiling tiles. "Appreciate that," he said, his speech slow and slightly slurred. The voice of a man who'd given 1,000 commands and now couldn't muster the energy to speak clearly. "How long was I under?" 11.5 hours, sir. The surgery completed without complications. "You're doing very well." She moved to his bedside and reached for his blood pressure cuff, which hung on the wall beside his bed like a mechanical serpent waiting to strike. The familiar weight of it in her hands made something in her chest tighten. Muscle memory. That's what the shrink at the VA had called it. Muscle memory made you good at things. Muscle memory was also why she woke up at 3 a.m. thinking she was still in Helmand Province, still checking the armor on her team, still trying to keep people alive with her hands. The cuff tightened around his upper arm, a slow squeeze that usually made people uncomfortable. He didn't flinch. She noted the reading, 118/76. Good. Stable. She unwrapped the cuff and moved to check his heart rate, pressing her fingers gently against his wrist, feeling for the pulse that his body was sending out in steady, reliable beats. 72 per minute. Perfect. She was aware of his eyes watching her now, the medication making them glassy and unfocused, the way he was studying her face as if trying to solve a puzzle he couldn't quite hold in his mind. She kept her expression neutral. Blank. The mask she wore every day at Oak Creek Memorial. "Your incision is looking good," she said, moving the blanket slightly to observe the surgical site without exposing him completely. The bandage was clean, no seeping, no signs of infection. The surgeon had done good work. She'd expected nothing less. Oak Creek Memorial had a 97% success rate on cardiac procedures. She'd looked that up during her second week, back when she was still trying to convince herself that working here was helping her heal instead of just hiding. "You should be ready for physical therapy by tomorrow afternoon if everything continues this way." "That's good news," he said, his voice soft. "Wife's going to want to take me home soon as possible." Can't blame her for that. Ashley didn't respond beyond a slight nod. Small talk was dangerous. Small talk led to questions, and questions led to conversations, and conversations could unravel the careful anonymity she'd woven around herself like armor. She finished documenting his vitals on the electronic chart, the keyboard making soft clicking sounds under her fingers, each keystroke a small anchor keeping her in the present tense instead of 6 years in the past. The general's eyes closed after a moment, exhaustion pulling him back under, his medication doing its work. She watched him for a few seconds longer, this man who had her name written on his skin, who had no idea who she was, who would probably never know. Then she stepped out of the room and closed the door quietly behind her. The hallway outside room 347 was empty at 6:14 a.m., those early morning hours when the night shift was winding down and the day shift was just beginning to settle in. Ashley stood for a moment, her hand still resting on the door frame, letting her breathing level out. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. The techniques the VA therapist had taught her, back when she was still pretending that civilian life made sense, that trading a rifle for a stethoscope was a reasonable career transition, that keeping your eyes down was the same as keeping yourself safe. The break room was empty when she walked in, and she poured herself a second cup of coffee from the pot that had been brewing since 5 a.m. The cup was one she'd brought from home 6 weeks ago, a blue ceramic mug that had survived exactly one drop onto the tile floor 2 days ago and had come away with a thin crack running down the side. She'd glued it back together with clear epoxy from the hardware store, and it held liquid well enough, though the crack was visible if you looked close enough. Most people didn't look that close. Most people didn't look at anything except what they wanted to see. She was standing at the break room window, watching the sun begin its slow rise over Raleigh, when Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway behind her. She knew this without turning around. She could read rooms the way she used to read terrain, exits, threats, angles of approach. The break room door had opened at 6:19 a.m. The footsteps were deliberate, heavy, the gait of a man who believed his weight in the world was actual weight, actual presence, actual power. Dr. Sterling. Attending physician. 7 years at Oak Creek Memorial. Son of a urologist. Married to a pediatrician. No children. Member of the golf club. Rumors of a kickback scheme involving imaging center referrals, though nothing had ever been proven, and Ashley had learned long ago not to pay attention to rumors. Rumors were just stories people told to make themselves feel important. Cooper, he said, and even his use of her last name alone was a calculation, a small assertion of hierarchy. "How's our mysterious night nurse finding things this morning?" Ashley turned slowly, coffee cup in both hands, the crack in the ceramic facing inward where nobody could see it. "Fine, Dr. Sterling. Room 347 is stable. Post-op numbers look excellent." He leaned against the counter with the kind of ease that suggested this was his territory and she was a guest in it. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with the kind of gym-maintained physique that looked impressive in scrubs and the kind of watch that cost more than her rent. A Rolex. She'd noticed it the first day, the way the light caught the face and the way he made sure people saw him checking it. The watch was important to him. That told her everything she needed to know about his insecurity. "You know, I've been meaning to have a conversation with you," he said, his voice pitched in that register that professional men used when they were about to say something they'd already decided was true. "Your credentials are a little unusual. 9 months in, and I'm still not entirely clear on your background." "I've worked ICU nursing," Ashley said. Her voice remained level. Her hands didn't shake. The coffee cup didn't tremble against her palms. 3 years total. My references are in my file. Right. Right. He smiled, and the smile was the kind that never reached his eyes. She'd seen that smile on the faces of men who enjoyed having power over people who couldn't fight back. "Well, just so you know, we like to have thorough understanding of our staff. Especially the ones who show up with minimal history. No family listed on your emergency contact. No social media footprint whatsoever. It's almost like you're trying to disappear." The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant beeping of a monitor from somewhere down the hall. Ashley set her coffee cup down on the counter, the crack facing him now, visible if he cared to look. She turned her head slightly, and for just a moment, a fraction of a second, something different passed across her face. Not anger. Not fear. Something older than both of those things. Something that had been forged in places that didn't have names on maps. "I prefer privacy, Dr. Sterling," she said. Each word was careful, measured, placed like a surgical stitch. "I'm good at my job. My patients recover. That's what matters." He held her gaze for a moment longer, the kind of stare that was meant to establish dominance, and then he smiled again. "Of course. Of course it is. Just making sure everything's above board, you understand. Hospital policy." He straightened up from the counter. "I'll be making rounds around 8 a.m. I'll expect room 347 to be spotless by then." She didn't respond, just picked her coffee cup back up and took a slow sip, tasting the bitter heat of it on her tongue. Dr. Sterling watched for a few more seconds, and then he turned and left the break room, his footsteps confident against the tile floor, the sound of a man who had already won the conversation in his own mind. What he didn't know was that at 6:23 a.m., while Ashley was standing in that break room listening to him speak, her phone had buzzed quietly in her pocket. A text from a number she hadn't heard from in 3 years. A number that only a handful of people had. The message was simple: "Need to talk. It's important. Asterisk." She set the cracked coffee cup down on the counter, and for just a moment, in the empty break room, her hands trembled. Not from fear. From the feeling of something long buried beginning to break through the surface, like the weight of something too heavy to hold down forever. The bet was already legendary by the time Ashley heard it. Dr. Sterling stood in the board conference room at 1147 hours, surrounded by 7 residents and the hospital's chief medical officer, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of a man who'd never faced consequences. "Gentlemen, I'm running a friendly wager," he said, adjusting his Italian cufflinks. "How long before our mystery nurse with no references quits on her own? I give her a week. Maybe 10 days if she's stubborn. Saves me the paperwork of firing someone who clearly can't handle real medicine." The residents laughed. Nervous laughter, the kind that comes when power speaks and subordinates obey the unspoken rule to find it amusing. By 1400 hours, Ashley was in the cafeteria loading a tray with black coffee and a sandwich she wouldn't eat. The break room smelled of old microwave popcorn and desperation, which was fitting. She'd chosen this anonymous position at Oak Creek Memorial specifically because no one asked questions here. No one dug. No one recognized the name tattooed on a retired general in room 347 or the woman who'd carried him to safety under fire in Tikrit 3 years ago. She'd paid 18 months of rent upfront using cash from her disability settlement, filled out her application with references from a staffing agency that didn't verify deeply, and disappeared into the fluorescent-lit corridors of a mid-sized North Carolina hospital where she could work shifts, save lives quietly, and pretend the PTSD would eventually stop clawing at her throat. The PTSD wouldn't stop. It was patient. It could wait. She was walking back to the unit when Dr. Sterling appeared, moving through the cafeteria like a man who owned the space. 3 residents flanked him, satellites orbiting a failing star. He was dressed for dominance, white coat pressed sharp enough to cut, stethoscope draped with the precision of a stage prop, the kind of presence that made nurses step aside instinctively. He wasn't watching where he was going. Or he was. Exactly. His left shoulder caught her tray at the perfect angle. Coffee cascaded across the white tile floor in a brown wave, spreading like a stain. The sandwich tumbled. The plate clattered. The entire cafeteria shifted into that particular silence that happens when humiliation is being performed for an audience. "Oh," Dr. Sterling said, his voice carrying no actual surprise. "My apologies." Then he bent down. Picked up a patient chart from a nearby table, not hers, but it didn't matter. He tossed it at her feet, papers scattering. The gesture was precise. Theatrical. A masterclass in public degradation. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, voice loud enough for the entire staff to hear. "Or is bending over too much for someone with your limited qualifications?" Ashley stood motionless. 6 seconds of absolute stillness. Around her, orderlies froze. A dietary aide turned away. 2 nurses exchanged glances that said everything. This was the moment, the test, the crucible where you either fought back or proved you were exactly what he'd suggested, someone desperate enough to take anything. She took one measured breath. The breath moved through her like a reset, the same breath she'd taken in the Jolin district before breaching a compound, before carrying Lieutenant Commander Halloway's body through 3 kilometers of active fire, before learning that some wounds never actually close, they just learn to live inside you quietly. She bent down. Gathered the papers. Stacked them with the careful precision of someone who'd been trained to move with purpose in hostile territory. Her movements were economical. Her hands were steady. She stood, papers aligned perfectly, and met his eyes. That's when the tear came. Just one. Not from fear. From something else, the weight of 3 years of invisibility, of being called incompetent by someone who'd never fired a weapon, never held a dying soldier, never made a decision that meant somebody's child came home or didn't. The tear moved down her cheek like it had all the time in the world. She wiped it away. Kept his gaze. "I've been called worse by better men, Doctor." The words landed in the cafeteria like a round downrange. Not loud. Precise. The kind of statement that doesn't need volume because it carries its own weight. Around them, the staff went absolutely still, the kind of silence that makes fluorescent lights seem impossibly loud, humming their electric song above everything. Dr. Sterling's smile froze. His jaw tightened. For a moment, maybe 2 seconds, something flickered behind his eyes. Recognition. Not of who she was, but of something. A miscalculation. A target that hadn't responded the way targets were supposed to respond. Ashley set the patient chart on a nearby table and walked back to the unit. Clocked in at 1,403 hours. Checked on her patients. Documented vitals with the meticulous precision that had kept soldiers alive in field hospitals. Her hands didn't shake. That wasn't restraint. That was something else entirely, the muscle memory of a woman who'd learned that composure was its own form of power. By 15:30 hours, during afternoon rounds on the orthopedic unit, Dr. Sterling moved through room 347 with the general still sedated, and then into the medication cart area where Ashley was pulling afternoon doses. The residents trailed him like remoras. He leaned against the counter with studied casualness, watching her load syringes with 0.5 milligrams increments of midazolam, checking dosages against charts with the precision of someone who'd been trained to notice discrepancies. "You know what I love about you, no name," he said. The name hung in the air like smoke. "You're so desperate to hide, you'll take anything I dish out. What are you running from? Malpractice lawsuit? Lost your license somewhere else? Family trouble?" She loaded another syringe. The pharmacy smell, alcohol prep pads, plastic, the sterile nothing of controlled substances, filled the space between them. "Nothing you'd understand, Doctor. Some of us chose this work to help people, not profit from them." His jaw locked. She'd noticed something. She'd been charting medications with the precision of someone who knew what 1 milligram of midazolam actually cost versus what his billing codes claimed, and the numbers didn't align. Not by a little. By thousands. By hospital billing fraud margins that would interest a medical board investigator. He straightened. Smiled that smile that never reached his eyes. Have a good shift, no name. At 18:47 hours, he was in his office on the 3rd floor, the door closed, the lights dimmed to the kind of afternoon amber that made everything feel like it was happening underwater. He opened his phone. Made the first call to his contact at the medical board, the one he'd done a referral favor for, steering orthopedic imaging contracts to a private imaging center that returned the favor with consulting payments Sterling claimed were clinical advisory fees. The contact owed him. Sterling was calling in the favor. The second call went to the hospital administrator, who had no idea that Sterling's billing codes had been inflating reimbursement rates for 3 years, that Ashley's meticulous charting was creating a paper trail that could eventually expose a system that had paid Sterling an extra $847,000 he wasn't entitled to. The third call was to a staffing agency in Chapel Hill, to an old colleague who'd worked with Ashley at some fictional previous hospital. The colleague, who owed Sterling money and knew the price of cooperation, agreed to confirm that Ashley had been terminated for falsifying credentials and medication documentation errors, nothing that would necessarily survive scrutiny, but something that would get an investigator's attention just long enough. The fourth call was to security. Brief. Professional. I need Ashley Cooper escorted from the premises at shift change. I discovered serious credentialing discrepancies. Liability issue. No warning. Straightforward termination. By 1945 hours, Sterling was reviewing her charting from the afternoon rounds. His eyes moved across the medication dosages she'd documented, then back to his billing codes from earlier surgeries. The discrepancies were visible if you knew how to look. And he knew exactly how to look because he'd created them. But that wasn't the worst part. At 0300 hours, the monitor in room 347 would alarm with a rhythm that made every nurse on the unit move, a cascade of events that would transform everything Sterling had planned into something far more complicated. The general's tamponade would decompensate at a rate that required someone to move fast. Someone to know precisely where the second intercostal space was, where the needle should enter, how much pressure would release the fluid compressing the heart without tearing tissue. Someone with the kind of hands that had held lives together. The general would see her face in those final moments before medication pulled him under, would recognize something, would whisper a word, "Tikrit," that would start a chain of events Sterling couldn't control with phone calls or corruption. But Sterling didn't know that yet. At 1945 hours, he was still in his office, closing his phone, smiling the smile of a man who believed he'd just neutralized a threat. He stood. Straightened his Italian cufflinks. Looked at himself in the reflection of his office window, a man whose power seemed immense, whose position felt secure, whose next 24 hours would include watching a quiet nurse with mysterious credentials be escorted out by security, saved from the effort of actual termination paperwork. At 2145 hours, Ashley sat in her apartment on the edge of her bed, looking at a framed photograph of her spotter from Tikrit, a specialist named Rodriguez who'd never made it home. She'd kept the photo in her locker at the hospital, hidden behind her spare scrubs. She was thinking about composure. About the mathematics of restraint. About how long a person could hold something down before it demanded to be released. She didn't know yet that at 0300 hours, composure would transform into command. That the nurse would become something else entirely. But the general in room 347 was sleeping, his chest rising and falling steadily, his heart beating in a rhythm that was about to become catastrophically wrong. And his monitor was already preparing to alarm. The monitor started singing at 0300 hours. 3 short beeps. 1 long wail. Then the rhythm that had been steady all night fractured into something wrong, something the machines recognized as catastrophe before any human in the hospital could piece it together. Room 347. The general's room. The bed where he'd been sleeping with a kind of peace that comes from a body believing it had finally escaped harm. Ashley heard it from the hallway. She was restocking the crash cart outside room 349, muscle memory moving her hands through the motions, checking the defibrillator pads, verifying the epinephrine doses, counting chest compressions in her head like prayer. The alarm cut through the fluorescent hum like a blade. She turned. Didn't run. Walked. Senior chief petty officers don't run through hospitals at 3 in the morning. They move with intention. With purpose. With the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. The monitor screen was chaos. Blood pressure 68/40 and dropping. Heart rate climbing into the 140s. The waveform didn't look like a heartbeat anymore, it looked like a man drowning in his own chest. Dr. Marcus Chen, the on-call resident, was standing at the foot of the bed with his hands at his sides. Frozen. Staring at the monitor as if it might explain itself if he waited long enough. He was 28, fresh from medical school, the kind of resident who had passed every test and failed every crisis. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Behind him, the night nurse, Patricia, good hands, steady voice, was backing toward the door to call the crash team, but Ashley was already moving past them both, reaching for the bedside table, her eyes reading the general's chart in the half-second it took to cross the room. Post-op day 1. Routine thoracic surgery. Complaining of shortness of breath at 2,245 hours. Vitals stable. And then the monitor alerted at 2,359 hours, but when Patricia checked, blood pressure had normalized. Cardiac tamponade. The fluid had been slow, patient, methodical, collecting in the pericardial sac around his heart like an executioner's noose, tightening 1 millimeter at a time. By 0300, it had compressed the heart so completely that blood pressure was becoming theoretical rather than actual. For minutes of this rhythm. Maybe 5. "I need a pericardiocentesis tray," Ashley said. Not asked. The words came out with the weight of someone who had given orders in languages 3 different countries didn't speak anymore. The weight of someone whose decisions had kept people alive on 6 continents. "We should call for backup," Dr. Chen said. Still frozen. Still useless. The attending is 23 minutes away. Patient has 4. Ashley's hands were already moving, already scrubbing, already opening the sterile field with the precision of someone who had performed this procedure under actual fire in Fallujah. The civilian version was simpler. Cleaner. Less likely to get interrupted by mortar fire. "Help or step back, doctor." The resident stepped back. Patricia handed her the 14-gauge needle without being asked. Hands that had learned Ashley's movements in 3 shifts, the way good nurses do, by watching someone move and recognizing competence before credentials. The needle was cold in Ashley's grip, steady, sure. She located the angle, the point where the 5th and 6th ribs articulated with the sternum, where the pericardium lay just beneath the surface like a membrane holding the general's life inside. Blood pressure 52/28. O2 sat 81 and falling. The machines were screaming their numbers into the dark of the hospital at 0302 hours. She pushed the needle in. There was a give, the resistance of tissue parting, the slight resistance of the pericardium surrendering. Then the hiss. A sound like air escaping a pressurized chamber. Like a lung deflating. Like a man's life returning to his chest through a tube the width of a ballpoint pen. The syringe filled with dark fluid, blood pooled where it didn't belong, fluid that had been slowly strangling the general's heart with the patience of someone who understood the meaning of time. 20 cc 30. 40. Each withdrawal was a countdown resetting itself. O2 sat climbed. 81, 87. 92, climbing steady like a ladder leading back to breathing. Blood pressure responded first. 65/35. Then 78/42. The monitor's rhythm smoothed, the chaos resolving into the organized electrical pattern of a heart that had been given permission to beat again. By 0305 hours, the general's sinus rhythm was steady, his blood pressure stabilizing at 95/58, not perfect, but alive. Not theoretical anymore. Real. Run another set of vitals, Ashley said. She was still holding the needle with the kind of steadiness that comes from practice, from repetition, from having done this in a mobile surgical unit outside Tikrit while rounds came in from the north and someone's radio kept calling Angel 6, Angel 6, Angel 6. Get me 2 units of fresh frozen plasma and establish a second full line. Prepare for the possibility of repeat pericardiocentesis. Dr. Chen moved. Not because he understood the order, his blank expression suggested he was still processing the last 15 seconds, but because the voice that had issued it carried the kind of authority that medical school never teaches. The kind that comes from being responsible for 214 Marines' lives. The kind that comes from decisions made at 0400 hours that meant people went home or didn't. Patricia was already moving, already pulling the medications, already running. The morning shift was starting to arrive in the halls outside, voices calling to each other about coffee and tired shifts and who had called in sick. They had no idea that in room 347, a man who had been dying was instead waking up. By 0330, the general's eyes were open. His hand found Ashley's wrist, his fingers weak but present, the touch of someone who had been on the wrong side of unconsciousness and was grateful to be back. He tried to speak. Couldn't manage it. Tried again. What? Cardiac tamponade, Ashley said. Her voice was steady, professional, the voice of a nurse explaining a complication to a post-op patient at 3 in the morning. Fluid around your heart. We drained it. You're stable now. He nodded. His eyes were still cloudy from the anesthesia, from the medication they'd pumped into his system to keep him sedated while his body healed itself. His eyes didn't focus on her name. Didn't see the tattoo that had been expecting to find her for 23 years. That was fine. That was better. Invisibility was safer. Invisibility meant no one had to know what she'd been before she decided to disappear. The documentation came next. Ashley sat at the computer station in the hallway at 03 for 7 hours, typing the report that would become part of the general's medical record. The emergency intervention. The procedure. The drugs. The response. Everything documented with the precision that comes from military training, every decision on record, every action accounted for, every choice traceable to the person who made it. She didn't know that down in his office, Dr. Sterling was awake. Didn't know that he'd received a call at 0318 hours from his contact at the medical board, the one he owed favors to, the one he'd referred patients to, the one who understood that kickbacks were just business under a different name. Didn't know that Sterling had already begun making calls. Already begun building the narrative. Already begun orchestrating the machinery that would undo her by morning. The contact at the medical board had a file opened at 0320 hours. A supposed former supervisor of Ashley's from a previous position, a fabricated reference Sterling had been preparing for weeks, complete with a phone number that routed to an accomplice, a rehearsed script about disciplinary issues, about unprofessional conduct, about a woman who couldn't be trusted. By 0331 hours, that phone call had been made. By 0345 hours, the hospital administrator had received a worried note from Sterling about the unauthorized pericardiocentesis, technically correct, profoundly misleading, positioned as evidence of a reckless procedure performed without proper authorization. But Ashley didn't know any of that yet. At 0400 hours, she was still in room 347, checking the general's vitals one more time, watching his blood pressure stabilize further, listening to his lungs clear as his heart pumped oxygen back to his extremities with the rhythm of someone given a second chance. At 0400 hours, she was still just a nurse in a hospital in Raleigh, her secret still secret, her past still invisible, her morning still ahead of her like a door that hadn't opened yet. The next words came at 0430 hours. Not from the monitor. From the hallway. From security. From the hospital administrator who wouldn't meet Ashley's eyes and held an envelope in his hands like it was something contagious. "We need you to come with us," the administrator said. Not a request. Not a discussion. The kind of sentence that comes with finality built into its structure. Ashley set down her pen. She was in the break room when security found her, a small space with a refrigerator that hummed like a tired prayer and a wall calendar someone had abandoned in March. She'd been making notes, processing the emergency, her mind still in the procedural space where it had gone during the crisis. It took her a moment to surface. To understand what the words meant. To recognize that the machinery had already been set in motion before she'd even finished saving a life. "I'll need to get my things," Ashley said. Her voice was level. Professional. The voice of a senior chief petty officer who had been relieved of duty before, who understood the mechanics of dismissal, who knew that fighting made it worse. She stood. Walked past them without waiting for permission. The administrator hurried to keep pace. Her locker was on the 3rd floor. A small metal rectangle with a combination lock that she'd opened the same way every day for 3 months. The inside held the remnants of a civilian life, a cracked coffee mug with the hospital logo, a dying succulent that had never adapted to fluorescent light, a photograph in a frame. The photo was from Tikrit. 2009, before the bridge. Before everything broke. Sergeant Marcus Reed was grinning at the camera in full kit, his face young and certain of the future in a way that only people who hadn't seen it arrive could be certain. He was dead now. IED. The bridge evacuation. The moment Ashley had chosen to carry the general to safety instead of carrying Marcus anywhere at all. She packed the mug. Packed the plant. Packed the photograph. The security guard stood nearby, professional and uncomfortable in the way people are when they're enforcing a decision they don't understand. At the bottom of the locker, hidden beneath the uniform jacket she'd bought to fit in, were the boots. Combat boots. Worn leather mold to the shape of feet that had hiked through mountains in 3 countries, that had walked checkpoint lines and carried wounded men and run under fire. She'd planned never to wear them again. Never to see them again. Never to be reminded of the woman who'd owned them. She packed them last, hidden at the bottom of the cardboard box security provided. Hidden under everything else. Hidden the way she'd hidden herself. By 05:45 hours, they were walking her through the lobby of Oak Creek Memorial. The early morning shift was arriving, nurses coming in for the 6 a.m. transitions, doctors heading to the cafeteria for coffee that hadn't been made yet. They watched. Nobody met her eyes. In room 347, the general slept without knowing. In his office, Dr. Sterling watched from a window with something that might have been satisfaction on his face. The automatic doors opened into Raleigh at dawn. Rain was falling. Not gentle rain. The kind that hammered the pavement like applause for something terrible. Ashley stood at the bus stop on Fayetteville Street with her cardboard box and her ruined life and the understanding that invisibility had cost more than she could afford. 23 years the general had carried her name on his arm. 23 years she'd carried the weight of being invisible. And in the span of a single emergency, she'd managed to save him one more time while destroying everything she'd built. The rain soaked through her scrubs. She didn't move. Didn't seek shelter. Just sat on the bench with her box and waited for a bus that didn't care who she was, wondering if choosing to disappear had been worth the cost. The rain fell at 0430 hours like a judgment, steady and indifferent, the kind of rain that didn't care if you were sitting on a bus bench or making phone calls from a hospital office. Dr. Sterling sat behind his desk, the fluorescent glow of his computer screen casting his face in shades of clinical green, and he picked up his phone with the satisfied exhale of a man who'd just watched his problem walk out of his life. For calls? That's all it would take. For calls to erase Ashley Cooper from Oak Creek Memorial's records as cleanly as she'd erased herself from the world. The first call went to Dr. Marcus Hayes at the medical board, a man who owed Sterling favors dating back 7 years, favors involving patient referrals to a diagnostic imaging center that paid Hayes a 15% consulting fee whether the referrals were medically justified or not. Sterling's voice was smooth, practiced, the voice of a man who'd made this calculation 1,000 times before. Marcus, we have a situation. A nurse on my unit, no verifiable background, no references that check out, performed an unauthorized procedure in the ICU without physician oversight. Pericardiocentesis. Unsupervised. I'm documenting her as a liability, and I need the board to corroborate a history of poor judgment. The silence on the other end lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then, how many calls are you making? Sterling smiled. 3 more. You'll want to be the first one on record. Hayes agreed. He had no choice. The favor was a debt, and debts collected interest. The second call went to Richard Kessler, the hospital administrator who managed Oak Creek Memorial's budget with the precision of a man who understood that salaries paid came from procedures billed. Sterling kept this one shorter, more clinical. Richard, I'm terminating a nurse for violating chain-of-command protocols. She performed an invasive procedure without attending physician authorization. The patient is a high-profile retired military case, which means we're already exposed to potential liability claims. I'm recommending we document this termination as urgent, grounds for immediate dismissal. He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. The alternative is that her charting practices draw attention to billing irregularities on other cases. I'm sure that's not something we want under scrutiny. Kessler understood immediately. The billing irregularities were his irregularities too, the one Sterling had carefully taught him to recognize and ignore. Immediate termination, Kessler said. I'll have HR paperwork ready by 0600. The third call was pure fiction, the kind of lie that felt almost artful in its construction. Sterling had pulled a name from the internet, Dr. Linda Castellano, supposedly a former supervisor at a regional clinic in Virginia that had closed 2 years prior. He dialed a number he'd found for someone with that name, and when a woman answered, he simply didn't correct her assumption that this was official business. Dr. Castellano, I'm calling regarding a former employee, Ashley Cooper, who listed you as a reference. I'm conducting a pre-termination background check. He let the word termination hang in the air like bait. The woman on the other end, who wasn't Dr. Castellano at all, just someone with the same name who worked in billing at a different hospital entirely, had no idea what Sterling was asking, but his tone implied she should. Yes, well, I can't discuss personnel matters, she said carefully. And Sterling smiled, because he hadn't needed her to say anything. He had a date, a name, and a recorded line. He had the appearance of corroboration. That was all the medical board required. By 0500 hours, the paperwork was moving. By 0530, security had been notified. By 0545, a guard named Rodriguez with a kind face and a job to do was walking beside Ashley through the corridors of Oak Creek Memorial, her cardboard box held against her chest like a shield. Inside it, a ceramic mug with a chip along the rim from the break room, a succulent plant that had turned brown weeks ago from her forgetting to water it, and a photograph in a plastic frame, slightly water-stained, of a man in full tactical gear with a call sign written on his armor in white tape, Breaker. Her spotter. The one who didn't come home. The guard didn't make eye contact as he walked her to the employee entrance. He didn't say he was sorry. He just held the door open and stepped aside, and Ashley walked out into the pre-dawn darkness where the rain was coming down in sheets, hammering the parking lot asphalt like applause for a performance no one wanted to see. The emergency lights of the hospital cast everything in shades of red and blue, the colors of sirens, of arrival, of lives being saved, and then she was beyond them, beyond the reach of that light, walking to the bus stop 2 blocks down Elm Street where the shelter was broken and the bench was wet. She sat at 0600 hours exactly, her cardboard box on her lap, rain dripping from her shoulders onto the cardboard in slow, irregular beats. Her phone had been disconnected for non-payment 3 days ago. Her apartment keys were in her scrub pocket. The eviction notices had been sliding under her door for 8 weeks in increasingly formal language, each one stamped with a date and a dollar amount that grew larger as the weeks progressed. 2 months behind. $6,100. She'd calculated it 17 times. 17 times she'd done the math and arrived at the same answer, she didn't have it. She'd chosen invisibility instead of connections, instead of help, instead of calling her brother who'd offered money and forgiveness 3 years running if she'd just come home. Home. She couldn't go home. Home required explaining, and explaining required admitting that the bridge at Tikrit had broken something inside her that 12 years of medication couldn't fix. The rain soaked through the cardboard. She could feel it getting soft, the bottom beginning to separate from the sides. The succulent was definitely going to die now, submerged in brown water that was collecting in the corners. The photograph of Breaker was protected inside the plastic frame, at least. His face was still clear, the slight scar along his left eyebrow, the expression he always made when she was about to do something he considered reckless, a look that was half disapproval and half absolute faith that she'd pull it off anyway. They'd held the bridge together for 6 hours. They'd carried people out on their backs while rounds snapped overhead like arguments with God. Breaker had carried 3 people. She'd carried 12. On the 7th rotation, when Breaker went back for one more, his chest took 3 rounds in the space of 4 seconds and he fell backward into the courtyard below, and she didn't go after him because if she did, 12 people would die instead of 1, and that was the mathematics of war. That was also why she couldn't go home. Because her brother would look at her with that expression that said he understood, which was worse than if he didn't understand at all. Because understanding meant acknowledgement, and acknowledgement meant she couldn't hide anymore. The bus was supposed to arrive at 0615. It was 0612 now. She could see the schedule posted inside the shelter, the letters faded by years of rain and sun. Route 7, every 30 minutes, 24-hour service. She'd ridden it for 4 months without anyone asking her name. Without anyone looking twice. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she'd saved a man's life at 03 for 5 hours, had put her hands inside his chest and had her hands steady themselves through muscle memory and decades of training, had felt the fluid release when she withdrew the needle and heard his oxygen saturation climb from 68 to 88, had done the thing she was trained to do and was best at doing, and in doing it, she destroyed herself. One good act. 5 minutes of competence. And it had cost her everything. Again. The rain kept falling. Her phone was dark in her pocket, disconnected, a brick of plastic and memory that used to hold numbers she didn't call. Her cardboard box was falling apart. The bus rounded the corner 3 blocks down, its headlights catching the rain and turning it to liquid silver, and Ashley sat perfectly still, waiting for it to arrive, wondering if invisibility was a choice or just a slower way of disappearing, wondering if there was any difference at all. She had no idea what was about to walk through those hospital doors in 4 hours. She had no idea that at that exact moment, the retired Navy SEAL general was waking up in a hospital bed, medication clearing from his system like fog lifting from an ocean, and his left arm was extended, and his eyes were finally focusing on the name tattooed over his heart, a name he hadn't spoken in 17 years, a name he hadn't let himself remember because remembering meant acknowledging the debt, and he was about to do something about it. The general's eyes opened at 08 for 7 hours, the medication fog lifting like storm clouds breaking over open water. His left arm extended across the white hospital sheet, and there it was, the name tattooed over his heart in ink that had faded but never disappeared. Ashley. Not Ashley the ICU nurse. Ashley Cooper. Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper. 17 years evaporated. One name brought it all back. The bridge at Tikrit, the amber dust, round snapping past like angry hornets, her voice on the radio, steady, no tremor, no fear, calling in their position while holding the perimeter with nothing but a 9mm and tactical precision that made her a legend among legends. His hands shook. For the first time in 42 years of active service, his hands actually trembled. He pressed the call button. The same nurse from yesterday appeared, young, efficient, utterly forgettable. "I need to make calls," the general said, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, low and unmistakable. "Discharge papers. I need my phone." By 09:10 hours, he'd made 4 calls of his own. The first went to Admiral Hayes at Naval Special Warfare Command. The second to the FBI's Washington field office, his contact there a former SEAL who owed him a favor from 2009. The third to the hospital's board chairman, whom he'd met at a Pentagon gala in 2019. The fourth to his son, Lieutenant Commander David Patterson, stationed at Camp Lejeune, telling him to get to Raleigh in 4 hours with anyone from his unit who could document service records. Nobody told the general no. Not anymore. At 1,130 hours, the ER doors burst open and a man stumbled through with a lacerated forearm, blood dripping onto the tile in a rhythm like a broken metronome. The triage nurse seated him, started paperwork, didn't think twice. The man was Iraqi, 50s, weathered face, eyes that had seen things, and he kept repeating something in Arabic until a translator arrived. The translator's face went pale. She called for the charge nurse. The charge nurse called for the medical director. Within 8 minutes, the entire medical staff and board members reviewing Sterling's file in the adjacent conference room heard the man's voice rising, speaking rapid-fire English with an accent thick as diesel smoke. That woman. The one who held the bridge at Tikrit for 6 hours while we pulled our families out. I was there. My unit was pinned. She didn't leave her position. Not once. I didn't think I'd see her alive again. Ashley wasn't in the ER. Ashley was sitting in a job placement office, filling out applications to work in construction, anywhere that didn't require a background check or references, when her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Senior Chief Cooper. The voice was crisp, professional, unmistakably military. This is Captain James Morrison, Naval Medical Corps. How quickly can you get to Oak Creek Memorial? The general was in a wheelchair against medical advice, his discharge line disconnected, dressed in a borrowed set of scrubs because his clothes smelled like the ICU, like antiseptic and plastic and false hope. His son burst through the doors in dress blues, saluting his father before reaching Ashley as she walked into the main conference room, confusion written across her face like graffiti on a wall no one had bothered to clean. Senior Chief Petty Officer, Lieutenant Commander Patterson said, his voice cracking slightly. "Welcome home." Ashley's jaw tightened. Her hand steadied. She didn't ask questions. She didn't tremble. She stood at attention, muscle memory overriding everything else. The Navy SEAL captain stepped forward, file in hand, reading aloud as the hospital board members fell silent like dominoes tipping backward. Bronze Star with Valor, he announced, each word landing like a gavel. The room absorbed it. He paused. Purple Heart. Another pause. Board members exchanged glances. Dr. Sterling, standing in the corner because he'd been called in at 1,200 hours to explain the termination, felt something inside him begin to collapse like a building losing its foundation. Navy Cross, the captain continued, and that was when the Admiral arrived. The Admiral was 73 years old, decorated like a Christmas tree, and he walked into that conference room with the kind of presence that made the air pressure change. He looked at Ashley the way you look at a monument you've read about but never expected to actually see. He read from a second file, adding decorations and commendations that kept appearing like playing cards in a magic trick, 2 additional commendations for Valor, a Navy Achievement Medal with V device, a Joint Service Commendation Medal, a Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal. 12 years of service. 3 deployments to Tikrit, Sanjin, and Fallujah. 217 lives directly saved. A unit citation. A commanding officer's recommendation for officer candidate school that she'd declined. Dr. Sterling's face drained of color the way water drains from a bathtub, completely, finally, without mercy. The Admiral finished, and she did all of this while being called a mystery nurse with no references. She saved this general's life twice. Once under fire in 2008. Once last night with a needle and nerves of steel. That's when the FBI agents entered the room, 2 of them, with the kind of quiet authority that made everyone understand that entertainment had officially ended and business was about to begin. The lead agent, a woman named Torres with steel-gray eyes, turned directly to Sterling and said exactly 3 words, "You need counsel." The investigation had been running for 93 days. The imaging center referral scheme. The medication dosages that never matched charges. The pharmacist who'd flagged irregularities. The administrative assistant who'd kept copies of billing records that showed Sterling's signature on documents authorizing prescriptions for imaging studies that never actually happened. The kickback scheme was systematic, calculated, and worth approximately $847,000 in fraudulent billing over 4 years. Cooperation is no longer optional, Torres said, and Sterling understood immediately that his career wasn't just over, it was being dismantled in real time by federal law enforcement. The same security guard who'd handed Ashley her cardboard box that morning approached Sterling with an identical box, sealed with the hospital's property office tape. The guard had been working at Oak Creek Memorial for 18 years. He'd watched Ashley pick up her box with dignity and no complaint. He handed Sterling his box with perfect formality. "I believe you know the way out, sir." The hospital lobby fell silent. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer. Ashley stood in the center of the room, and for the first time in 6 months, her shoulders came back. Her spine straightened. The quiet, deferential nurse vanished like morning fog. What remained was the woman who'd held an entire position against overwhelming odds, who'd made decisions that saved lives, who'd chosen invisibility not out of weakness but out of strength. She looked at the general in his wheelchair, and he looked back, and something that had been broken in both of them on a bridge in Tikrit 17 years ago, something that had been carried in silence and trauma and the weight of survival, finally understood that the other person was real. "Thank you for coming back," the general said. Ashley's voice, when it came, was steady as a surgical laser. "Thank you for remembering, sir." 6 months later, the hospital held a reorganization ceremony in the main auditorium. Ashley wore navy dress blues, her chest bearing the same medals the Admiral had announced that day, the one she'd stored in her cardboard box instead of wearing, instead of claiming. She'd been appointed Director of Emergency Medical Services at Oak Creek Memorial, overseeing the ICU, the ER, the trauma bay. The same rooms where she'd been humiliated, now under her command. The general attended in full uniform. His son stood beside him. Karim, the Iraqi translator, sat in the third row with his wife and 3 children, all of them alive because Ashley had held her position. The SEAL captain was there. The Admiral sent a recorded message that played on screens positioned throughout the auditorium. On her new office desk sat those worn combat boots, the one she'd carried at the bottom of her cardboard box, the only proof of a life before the shame. Beside them was a photo, the general kneeling before her on the day of her reinstatement, his hand over his heart, tears streaming down his face, finally remembering the woman who'd saved his life twice. The hospital established the Ashley Cooper Combat Veteran Employment Initiative that same month. It offered jobs, healthcare, and mandatory PTSD support services to any military veteran seeking civilian employment in medical fields. The cracked coffee mug from the break room, the one that had been in her box, was repaired using kintsugi, that ancient Japanese art that fills broken places with gold. It sat on her desk next to her hospital nameplate, a reminder that breaks don't define you. How you mend them does. Ashley led morning rounds now, her voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from having survived the worst and choosing to help others do the same. She passed room 347 where a new patient lay recovering, a former army medic, hands trembling, flinching at the intercom, eyes carrying that distant look of someone who'd seen too much and trusted too little. Ashley recognized herself from 6 months ago. She sat beside his bed after rounds, pulled up a chair, and spoke quietly about Tikrit, about the bridge, about choosing invisibility, about the courage it takes to be seen again. Across town, Dr. Sterling sat at a folding table outside a Save-A-Lot grocery store, wearing a polo shirt with an insurance company logo, his medical license suspended indefinitely, his marriage dissolved, his colleagues returning calls no longer. He watched pedestrians avoid eye contact the way Ashley once had. His house was being sold to pay attorney fees. His Mercedes was gone. The medical board had recommended permanent revocation of his license pending the outcome of federal charges. The imaging center's CEO, facing his own indictment, had named Sterling as the architect of the entire scheme. Sterling sold supplemental health insurance to people who didn't want it, who looked through him like he was invisible, who would never know that he'd once been feared and powerful and wrong about everything. And in room 347, a new veteran took his first tentative steps with assistance, and Ashley stood beside him, her hand steady on his shoulder, whispering the same word someone had whispered to her once: "You're not broken. You're just healing." And healing doesn't happen alone. If you made it this far, you understand that true heroism isn't always what you see in the spotlight. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns, and the ones who've survived the worst are often the ones who give the most. Hit that like button, subscribe to stay updated on stories like this one, and comment below, what would you have done if you were in Ashley's position? What does it mean to truly honor service? Thank you for watching.